Hello, welcome. Coming up tonight, $6 trillion man. Does the US economy need Biden's stimulus plan? Spend. Are we all just Keynesians now? Lockdown hangover. Should we fear the economic fallout of the lockdowns? And Eastern promise. Are the UK and India edging towards a free trade agreement? All of that coming up. So welcome again, welcome to tonight's show with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Coming up on tonight's show, I'll be joined by Konstantin, comedian and star of the Trigonometry YouTube channel, Julian JESSOP, independent economist and former chief economist here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and KARIN SVANBORG-SJOVALL, author, entrepreneur and former Director General of TIMBRO, our sister think tank in Sweden. Now things are finally opening up. We'll discuss what we think the biggest economic fallout of this pandemic will end up being. Will it be unemployment, housing, spending? After that, we'll look across the world to the new announcement of a UK possible trade deal with India and consider not only how much of it was based on an IEA report released less than a fortnight ago, but also what it means for the future of UK-India trade and trade more generally, if we think more progress will be made soon or if other barriers might get in the way. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Tom Palmer, Executive Vice President of the Atlas Network of free market think tanks across the globe, and Dr. Andrew LILICO, Executive Director of Europe Economics, as we explore Joe Biden's spending splurge and whether the days of fiscal restraint on both sides of the pond are well and truly past, and whether we really are all Keynesians now. But before we get into the meat of the show, the big announcement I'm delighted to make today is that the IEA has officially launched its Patreon page. You now have the opportunity to support the Institute of Economic Affairs on Patreon, where we've set up a membership platform that allows our followers to donate solely towards our digital online work. Alongside this, as you subscribe as an online patron to exclusive IEA perks, you'll get bespoke benefits, priority access to our content, and much more. If you'd like to play a key role in directly helping the IEA in producing stimulating educational online content, head over to patreon.com/IEA London. I'll be sure the team includes a link in the chat, and I hope to engage and interact with all of you who wish to support our digital work in becoming an IEA online patron. Go over there and sign up now. Now it's time to get into the show. Andrew, good evening to you. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. I've been making use of the various extra freedoms that we finally now have. A bit of drinking, bit of sport, bit of watching you.
Excellent, marvelous. And Tom Palmer, fantastic to have you with us. You're joining us from the great city of Seattle. Good morning to you, Tom. How are you keeping?
Good morning. It's wonderful. It's almost like being in Britain because it rained all day, 24 hours. But today's a beautiful sunny day, and I'm so happy to be with IEA, one of my favorite organizations on the planet.
Well, that's great. And Tom, I want to start with you. What are we to make of your new president's spending package? $6 trillion in proposals. That doesn't necessarily mean all of that will go ahead, but I think the best part of $2 trillion of it has already been approved. The 1.9 trillion that's been approved is only marginally below Bill Clinton's deficit for his 8-year-long presidency. And we're only in the first 100 days of the Biden presidency. And here, Tom, is a stat to conjure with. More than half of US debt has been racked up since 2008, public sector debt. If all $6 trillion of this package were to go ahead, then it would be true that almost 2/3 of all American debt issued in your 245-year history, when you unceremoniously kicked us out back in the day, will have been racked up in the last 13 years, 2/3 of it in the last 13 years. What are we to make of this? This is spending going absolutely crazy, isn't it, Tom?
It is. In the context, it's very important to remember this is a continuation of a trend that has gone under both parties, quite frankly. So this year, the Congressional Budget Office announced that they're anticipating the second largest fiscal deficit since 1945, so since the end of the war. It's at 10.3% of GDP. The only other year that was greater was last year. And so we had, when it was 14.9. So this is really a bipartisan spending fest. Both parties have done this. And there is currently in the Congress almost no one who's willing to stand up for any sense of fiscal responsibility. It's just shocking. Now, the other element to bring in is that we've been told that this is an infrastructure bill. And there are infrastructure issues, right? There are bridges that need to be painted and weatherized and so on. But we're being told that healthcare is infrastructure, daycare is infrastructure, elder care is infrastructure. Everything is infrastructure. And so they're pushing this through, and it's going to mean a huge number of new entitlements that people will quickly become used to. Either they're called infrastructure and emergency care and so on. And rolling those back is going to be very, very difficult, because once someone expect and become accustomed to a benefit, taking it away is far more painful. The pain experience is far greater than the pleasure that they got in getting the entitlement in the first place.
Andrew, what are your take on this? I mean, Joe Biden's proposed stimulus spending plan is indeed eye-watering, and because the US is such a big economy, $6 trillion. But this is pretty much the picture on both sides of the Atlantic, right? The spending taps are on, and there appears to be no sort of sign of switching them off anytime soon. Indeed, the flow is becoming greater and greater with each passing day.
Well, I think there's an important distinction here between what seemed like the best thing to do during the crisis itself and what's the best thing to do in the aftermath of the crisis. So I think that there was quite a consensus amongst economists of all stripes that during the period of the crisis itself, because of its very particular nature, that what you were trying to do was to actually, it wasn't that GDP was low because there was some shock or a changed outlook or something like that. The government was specifically trying to clamp down on GDP, to reduce economic activity, to reduce the way in which we interacted with each other. And because of that very particular nature of this crisis, I think there was quite a lot of consensus that maintaining spending as it was likely to be the right policy, partly because of the conditions, but also because it shouldn't necessarily mean that the long-term outlook of the economy was going to be worse. So it was quite a temporary matter. That, I think, is quite a different idea from the idea that as you recover from this crisis, therefore the way to get there is through some sort of government stimulated economic activity. It seems to me that actually what's going to happen here is we may see, insofar as we're not just going back to where we were, in which case what's the point of any stimulus at all, but insofar as things change, it's not going to be very obvious to the government exactly what the right way for things to change is. And if you stimulate and subsidize particular areas of the economy, the government's just guessing that those are the things that ought to survive in the future and that they oughtn't to be replaced by new things. It might be that lots of the businesses that there were in the past now need to disappear, and you now need to do something else. That could happen not only because of domestic changes, people working from home, and you lose all those sandwich bars in London and the commercial landlords and the office companies and so on, but also because there could be a reconfiguration internationally. It might be that in the light of these events, we change the patterns of trade, and the best things for us to do relative to other countries will change. So it seems to me that there's a very considerable danger of trying to pick winners in an environment in which there's far too much uncertainty, and it's much better to let the market resolve things for itself.
And Andrew, just before I come back to Tom, do you think we've now got into the cycle where spending is so colossal, that the deficit is so great, the debt is sort of unfathomable, the off-balance sheet liabilities of public sector pensions, and before we went live, I was talking to Tom, about Medicaid and Social Security. It's just so eye-watering that fiscal retrenchment just it's too big a problem to get your head around, isn't it? I was trying to think, if in personal terms I was £10 million in debt, I probably wouldn't think too much about spending another £1 million or so. The position is so catastrophically bad. I mean, it was Ronald Reagan who said $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and soon enough you're talking about real money. This has gone way beyond $1 billion here and $1 billion there, right, Andrew?
Yeah, one of the things that's going to happen here is inflation. So there's going to be some additional, we're already seeing some of it in the US. The monetary growth is extremely high and is likely to lead to inflation over the longer term. In these kinds of environments, I think there's going to be very little appetite for bringing spending down or putting taxes up. Except against a very few people, largely for non-fiscal raising, more for punishing success kinds of reasons. You're going to see a bit of inflation. I'm not talking 1970s type inflation, but I think that it's going to be a bit more inflation than we've been used to. And the reality is that it'll probably be a little bit of inflation will be enough for us to get ourselves through to a situation where people start to have an appetite for a bit more discipline once again. I don't think it's really scarred us in that sense. We'll get back our appetite for fiscal discipline, but it'll take 5 years or so, and in the meantime we'll see a bit of inflation.
Tom, on your side of the pond, where is the sort of appetite for fiscal discipline? If I was thinking back to the early 90s when I was at university, and then the Clinton years, there was almost some degree of fiscal discipline on both sides of the aisle, right? But now there seems to be limited fiscal discipline on either side of the aisle. Is there anybody in the US in politics, I don't mean in the think tank or the public intellectual square, but in politics, who's sort of waving their hands in the air saying, this is disastrous, we can't be spending all this money? Or is it a case that the kind of Republicans overspend enormously and the Democrats overspend even more enormously?
The sad reality is the answer is no. At the moment, the Republican response has been to talk about Dr. Seuss and the publisher's decision not to reissue books that had racist characters from the 1930s and 40s. That's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the spending. They have given up on that, and frankly, they don't care. I'll just be very frank about that. Trump unleashed an extraordinary wave of statism into the Republican Party, picking winners, deciding what industries are going to be supported, and so on. And the Democrats have run with it. So this new spending bill has $50 billion to create a technology directorate to pick winners, money to create innovation hubs where local and regional governments will be able to pick winners and decide what's going to work. This is really asking for disaster. Now, the reason why we saw under the Clinton years, not the first two, but the six, some fiscal discipline, actually quite substantial, to be honest, they reached a balanced budget, was because it was divided government. That, I think, is the key. And the good news, although there's no one in the GOP really who's in favor of fiscal discipline, certainly in the House, the Senate's a different matter. If the Republicans take the House, they will take the side of fiscal responsibility just because they're in opposition. That still will be a good thing. I think that's going to be important. I much prefer divided government. We found when you have one party in charge of the Congress and the White House, doesn't matter what party, you're more likely to go to war and you're more likely to spend and spend and spend because no one's asking hard questions. So the next midterm elections, there may be a traditional midterm correction. If the Republicans take the House, at least they'll have an incentive to talk about fiscal discipline. And we might go back to that Clinton a period of more restraint. That's the optimistic take on it.
And tell us, Tom, because I want to bring in Andrew on some of the semantics that are used in the arguments about spending here. But Tom, this package, and you say that it's sort of dressed up as infrastructure, as if it's a kind of investment rather than a spend. But can you give us a sort of indication of what it consists of? I mean, an anecdote here and small beer in the round, but our good friend Kate Andrews, regular on this program, formerly of this parish, as an American citizen, she has received, apparently, she wrote this up in The Spectator, her $1,400 stimulus check. here in London, and she'll obviously be spending it here in London. Thanks very much for subsidising a bit of spending in the London economy. Not very many things open she can spend it on. I mean, that can't be dressed up as infrastructure. How much of it, Tom, in broad terms, is just sort of we're going to throw money at people to try and get the economy going again, as if this has been a demand side problem, rather than, I don't know, building new Wi-Fi or 5G infrastructure or the rest of it?
Well, first off, there's $400 billion in that to pay for long-term care for the elderly and disabled. Now, maybe that's a good thing. I happen to think there are other ways to deal with this, but calling that infrastructure is absurd. It's just absurd. This is not infrastructure. It's a direct service that the government is now going to be financing. With regard to the stimulus payments and the increase in government grants, really what this has done is to muck up our labor market, just quite frankly. It's gone on far too long. If there was any justification on the basis of social stability, that's since passed. Right now, if you're a small business owner, if you're in the restaurant business, it's hard to find people to hire. Why is that? It's because they're waiting for all of the payments to cease. Those should have been cut back some time ago. There's a huge drain on the budget. I'm not being hard-hearted here. Most people would rather go back to work. I hope that with the vaccination going forward, this is one thing where the US government finally got more or less things in order. It's proceeding fairly well, relying on private pharmacies and so on to do this, that there'll be bigger pressure for getting rid of these payments to stay at home and bring people back into the labor force. I talked to a fair number of small business owners, and they say, we're begging people to come and work for us, and we can't find them. Well, we know why.
Andrew, Tom was saying that in America, this is sort of dressed up as a grand infrastructure project. One of the things that's made me annoyed over here in terms of the public debate is all spending seems to be described as investment. There's no distinction between the two, and there should be a distinction between the two, but people talk about investing in the NHS. What they actually mean is increasing nurses' wages. You might want to do that, but it's not investment. I don't talk about going down the pub and investing in a pint of beer. It's just consumption. Are we in danger of losing the economic terms have just got out of control? We're not seeing investment. We are seeing just basic old-fashioned stimulus, aren't we, Andrew?
Well, I think that's been a problem for some time. I think it was a Gordon Brown thing that's when I recall the term investment becoming completely dominant for any kind of public spending. And one of the things, though, in the UK is that at least there is a bit of a, what would you call it, an obsession or something in some parts of Boris Johnson's government for actual infrastructure, not necessarily in the most constructive places. I think they have in mind to, quite apart from some of the fun things, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, like, bridges to Northern Ireland and that kind of stuff. But I think they also have in mind that they would have spent quite a lot on infrastructure that probably wasn't necessary in some of those northeast areas where they won seats in the 2019 general election. Now, some of that's all got a bit delayed, but I think that they will go back to that in due course. And so just because the thing, I guess the point that I'm trying to make it there is just because the thing actually is infrastructure rather than just called infrastructure doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. You can waste money on infrastructure as well.
And Andrew, should we be looking at any key tipping points here? I know it's not going to be a binary answer, but if you're looking across other Western countries, Greece's debt is now topping 200% of GDP. In Italy, it's north of 150%, gone up 20% since COVID. France, 116%, up 18% since March 2020. Even trusty Germany has a debt of 70%, which has increased from 60% since COVID. I think here in the UK, we're hovering just below 100%. The old rule of thumb was sort of, if you go above 80%, very bad things happen. Was that rule of thumb wrong, or has it changed, or are really bad things about to happen?
Well, I think my kind of rule of thumb was that the Italians basically never default. So if you got at the outer envelope of where the Italians were, then you were probably in trouble because they would push that envelope to the edge. And if you think back to the period of the Eurozone crisis where the Italians were in trouble, they were up between 120 and 130% debt to GDP. So you probably don't want to be north of that. South of that, it's not necessarily any fun, but you can probably get by. And I think we'll get by. As I say, I think there'll be a little bit of inflation. I actually think that one of the things that will happen in the UK is we're going to have quite a burst of rapid economic growth for a while. I think we're looking at 7% this year. I think that we'll get ourselves back to levels, relative quarterly levels, maybe even later this year or into 2022. For 2022, I think we'll probably be not terribly far from pre-crisis levels of GDP. So I think that, and what happens after that, I think is kind of interesting. Is it that we carry the momentum of this fairly rapid economic growth through into something new? Or is it that maybe off the back of, I don't know, some of these trade deals that Liz Truss comes up with every week and that kind of stuff, or some structural changes in the world economy, maybe some withdrawal of China from the world economy in the light of these events? There could be opportunities for the UK actually to carry through some of that momentum into more rapid growth in the 2020s. It might be that actually the thing to think about in terms of tipping points isn't so much everything going disastrous, but what might be some of the signals that everything's actually going to turn out a lot better than expected. Because over the past year or so, relative to where people thought, we're probably above even the best, the upper case scenarios, certainly from bodies such as the Office of Budgetary Responsibility in the UK, so the UK sort of forecaster, government forecaster. So I think that actually that's probably the direction in which you want to look. What kinds of things would tell you, what are the markers of the way in which people adapt to working from home? What new purposes do all those office spaces in London get put to? Are they converted to housing, for example? Do we see some change in the housing structure of the housing market? Do people build extra housing outside London, and that leads to some kind of boom in that area? That would be the direction I'd look, rather than tipping points with things going badly, to be honest, just at the moment, other than maybe on inflation.
Tom, you sounded a slightly less optimistic note. I would be more relaxed about this spending if I was in Andrew's position. There's a one-off hit, the economy can bounce back to health. But are you more worried, Tom, that this is just part of an ongoing trajectory? It's not going to be a return to normal. We've got the spending taps on, we've got used to it, we've got addicted to it. Politicians are minded to make more and more promises on the campaign trail? Or is this a sort of one-off hit, a bit equivalent to being in a war? You've got to get out the other side of the war, and then you've got to rethink and rebuild? Or do you think this is a trajectory? You were mentioning, Tom, that benefits will come in that won't be seen as kind of wartime provisions or pandemic provisions. They'll be seen quite quickly as entitlements.
I think that the future is a little bit bleak in this regard, at least. I'm not totally bleak on the future of the American economy by any means. But in this element, this crisis is being used, as all crises are, by all parties as an opportunity to expand their powers. And that's what we're seeing happening, unfolding right before our eyes. There's virtually no opposition to it. This is one of the scary things. No one is talking about the massive spending, and in addition, the iceberg that's under the water. The unfunded liabilities continue to grow. And there has been zero attention to the Medicare and Social Security spending. And then at the state level, there is at least some attention to the unfunded liabilities with regard to pensions, because those are crushing in a number of states and localities. That part of the iceberg is bigger than the deficit that we see at the tip of it, and it continues to grow. On the question of inflation, I defer to Andrew on these questions as an economic prognosticator, but we've seen big run-ups in asset values. Housing prices have just gone through the roof in the United States, and similarly the stock market continuing. And some people are suggesting, well, that's where a lot of this spending is going. There is inflation, but it's in asset prices rather than consumer goods, which is where it's measured in the CPI. People are not looking at the fact that we're seeing this explosion in asset prices.
Andrew, is that right? We had Dominic Frisby, the comedian, commentator, all-round polymath on this show a few weeks ago. And he sort of put to me, don't believe the inflation numbers, we're measuring it wrong. And, whatever, the price of gold, the price of houses, the price of Bitcoins going through the roof, the fact that a bag of sugar doesn't cost much more in a supermarket is measuring the wrong thing. Do we have, Andrew, a bout of pretty serious inflation already, just not in the area where the ONS actually capture it or measure it?
I mean, I know some people claim that. I wouldn't really claim that, in that I think that by and large, the purpose of investment assets, those kinds of things, is ultimately to produce outputs for consumption. So what you really care about in the end of the day is what happens to your consumption prices. That's the real value of things. It might, doubtless there are a few things that are measured as assets where we get some durable consumption value out of them, and they're probably mispriced a little bit. I'm not saying that everything's perfect, but by and large, that's the thing I think one should really care about. Now, asset price booms can create their own problems. They're just not the same kind of thing as inflation. So I would say, not every bad thing has to be called inflation. A bad thing that you don't like can sometimes be called something else. So, for example, if your house prices are far too high or maybe house prices, perhaps let's take that as an asset, at least to some extent, for your young people to be able to buy any, then that's an issue of accessibility. It's not necessarily an issue of inflation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what sort of level, Andrew, of inflation would you sort of welcome? Again, is there a sweet spot? You know, would, I don't know, 5% inflation actually be a good thing? 10% disastrous? 0% disastrous? Is there some kind of, like, you know, what's the bullseye here?
So I'm probably not that disturbed by a little bit of adjustment. I probably would have welcomed, or not thought it unwelcome, to have inflation of 3, 4, 5% by the latter part of 2021, where we sat as of March, April 2020, when things seemed like they were going to be very grim indeed. As things stand, I'm more in the thinking that we're going to get 5% odd inflation, and that's not necessarily that desirable. I wouldn't say it's disastrous either. Actually, I think a little bit of inflating away the government's debts in an environment in which we're not able to raise other kinds of taxes than, as it were, the inflation tax, or to cut spending isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, provided that we don't then get stuck with it. So if we have 3, 5, 6% inflation, but then it rapidly comes back down to 2 or 3, then I think that's probably okay. If we start getting stuck with 5 or 6% inflation, then that's pretty bad, and it'll be quite painful to get it down. So it depends whether it's like a one-off levels shift or whether it comes down over time. So I don't think it's at all implausible, given the monetary growth that we've seen, that we get 5% inflation in the UK. I think it's almost baked in the cake. It might even go quite a lot higher than that in the US. And then the question is whether the authorities will have the discipline to bring it down. One thing that people may not have noticed is that in the past few months, the US have changed their inflation mandate, which they gave to the Fed, and introduced a system, which I happen to have been advocating for many years in a different context, called average inflation targeting, or price level targeting. Now, I think what they're going to use that for probably is as an excuse to see through inflationary episodes even more than in the past. They will say, oh, well, we've had a period of low inflation, so we can afford to have some high inflation to catch up. And that's the way that they'll view it. So it's probably a matter of to what extent they manage that average inflation rate back down to 3% or so, as opposed to leaving it at 5%.
Tom, before I bring our next guest on, Tom, what you say, sort of, unfortunately, nobody in the political space in America seems to much care about sound finance now. I'm guessing you're also going to tell me then there's nobody warning of potential inflation. We've just sort of got used to and expect low inflation and, interest rates of 0% or thereabouts. That's the new normal. Or is there anybody there over in the United States saying, whoa, if we do go down this path, then expect some potentially nasty things to happen? Hayek, of course, always compared inflation to a tiger. Once it's out, it's hard to tame. As Andrew said, there'd need to be the will to tame it if it got out of control. Any of these forebodings or forewarnings in the United States of America, or is it just carry on regardless and hope for the best?
Well, among the pundits, so the Wall Street Journal just had a piece today on the likelihood of inflation, and people are going to be unprepared for it, precisely because they've been in a I want to emphasize, relatively low inflation environment for a long time. And the Wall Street Journal piece said that's going to be a big surprise for a lot of people. So there is talk of this among informed economic commentators. On the political scene, I have to say, the culture war is absorbing most of the energy. And I think that's terrible, just terrible, because I don't want a culture war. I'd like to be able to live together with people who have different views about life. I don't need to be at war with them. The second thing is they're ignoring what can be really catastrophic if attention is not paid to it. So right now, the culture war is dominant, and economic discourse has been so dumbed down that in the political sphere, almost nothing. Again, if there's a correction in the next midterm elections for purely partisan reasons, the Republicans may begin to talk about fiscal discipline now that they're out of power. But that is just opportunism. Nonetheless, I would welcome it.
I think you're joining us now. We've sorted out your camera issues, so it's fantastic to have you with us. Konstantin KISIN, comedian, top YouTuber, political commentator. Good evening to you, Konstantin. How are you keeping, my friend?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me. You would have thought after a year of being stuck indoors, I would have sorted my tech issues out, but I really haven't, which is how you know I am a comedian.
Well, especially as a professional YouTuber, right?
Exactly.
I mean, your life depends upon it.
Yes. Well,
yeah.
My life is not going to last very long, and it's not going to be very good based on this performance.
Okay. Well, we started on a bleak note. Let's try and get a little bit more optimistic. What's your take on the present debt and spending position, Konstantin? Are we just, spending money like there's no tomorrow? And if you keep doing that, sooner or later, there won't be.
Well, we're sort of through the looking glass, aren't we? Like, none of the numbers make any sense anymore. And I think we're heading down further and further into something that we don't really understand. I mean, modern monetary theory tells us that we can borrow indefinitely. Somehow, I think most people don't believe that. I instinctively don't believe that. And I guess we'll find out. It worries me tremendously what we've done over the last year, because, historically, if you speak to economists, the cycle is you borrow in wartime and you save in peacetime and you recover the position. Well, we've been borrowing in peacetime, and now we've had the equivalent of wartime, and we've just borrowed more and more. So I think people should be very concerned about where we are. But obviously, if you give people free money, they're not going to be that concerned.
Tom and Andrew, let me get your closing thoughts, and then I'm going to bring in our last two guests to talk about the fallout from all of this. Tom, you were hinting at employment problems in the employment market, let alone the debt. And the deficit. That's one fallout. I mean, over here in the UK, 6 out of 10 young people have seen their earnings fall in the last year. 1 in 10 have lost their jobs. Some charities are forecasting as many as 1 million young people could be unemployed when the furlough scheme, the state support scheme, comes to an end. Is that the biggest? What do you expect on the biggest scarring of this to be? Or, can we overcome it? It's been a very, very grim year, but, we'll get back to where we were in February 2020 in a few weeks, a few months' time. Or do you think there's, Tom, some lasting damage about what we've gone through? I don't mean on the health side of it. Obviously, it's claimed a lot of lives, and many more people have been ill. I mean, on the economic side or the attitudinal side, what do you think the fallout will be? Even when everybody's vaccinated, nobody's dying of COVID anymore. Could there be some long-term scarring and damage to the economy that takes us, I don't know, a generation to shake off?
In a nutshell, very smart people disagree with me on this question. I'll tell you what I think. I think people, once they're vaccinated, are going to say, enough. We want to go back to work. We want to continue our lives. I have friends who share my general view on life who are more pessimistic. They think this is going to lead towards an acceptance of controls, that people will become accustomed to being bossed around. I'm more optimistic in this regard. I do think that most of us, we just desperately want to get rid of the masks. They're justified under the certain circumstances, but when we're vaccinated, let's get back to life. And this is one of the areas where, and we've been stressing, the market has performed remarkably well. Government has had a limited but important role in public health, but the market produced these stunning scientific advances. The vaccines, they're now available everywhere. I went shopping. groceries, and they said, announcement, we have extra vaccines. Anyone who wants them, come to the pharmacy now. And people were going over there. It's so gratifying. I'm a little bit more optimistic in this regard. The danger is we're getting more spending and more entitlements, and those are going to be hard to roll back. The other thing I should point out, good news today, a federal judge overturned the moratorium on rent collection. This has been so harmful to the housing market and to small landlords. It's just wiping them out, and is given people opportunistic occasion to just stop paying their rent. And the judge said the CDC does not have the authority to abrogate millions and millions of contracts. So fortunately, we have an independent judiciary.
So some clip of light. And Andrew, before you leave us, what do you think? You've been sounding a slightly more optimistic note about the bounce back, but do you think there's any long-term economic scarring to the economy we need to worry about, not just in the coming weeks or months, but I don't know, over the next 5 or 10 years?
I've really become quite bullish about this whole thing in the past few months. It seems to me that what we had in the UK was a period following the financial crisis where, for various reasons, combination of policy errors, fiscal, monetary, and so on, things have become unnecessarily stagnant. So I think we had quite an extended period of stuff being more stagnant than was kind of economically justified. And that one of the main consequences of these events is going to be to shake us out of our torpor. I think we're going to see all kinds of changes that were probably overdue. We're going to have more virtual working from home. We have more deliveries, more online shopping, more pay TV, huge medical advances. And I think that a lot of that stuff is going to some change in our structure of trade internationally. And I think these kinds of things create great opportunities for us. And I'm quite bullish about how things are going to go. It's not going to be painless. So as I was saying before, I think we're going to have probably going to have some inflation. We're going to carry over quite a lot of debt from the borrowing that we've done. There'll probably be some defaults later this year in the early part of our recovery, commercial landlords and that kind of thing. So some of that could be a little bit nasty. But it seems to me that the main scarring, as it were, permanent changes, are likely to take the form of shaking us out of our torpor and forcing us to do things that we probably should have been doing 5, 7, 8, even 10 years ago.
Tom, Andrew, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope it's not too long before we can meet up in person. Konstantin, stay with us. I'm going to introduce our last two guests in just a moment. But before I do so, just a reminder, we've launched the IEA Patreon offer today. If you haven't signed up, then go to the link that we're sharing now in the chat. For a very modest monthly donation, you'll get better access to our online content. You'll help us create more of it. And there's a whole load of other privileges depending on which membership sphere you sign up on. So go to patreon.com/IEA London, or just click on the link that my IEA team has shared in the chat and sign up today. A warm welcome to our last two guests, Julian Jessop, independent economist, fellow here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and KARIN SVANBORG-SJOVALL. Have I got it right this time, KARIN?
It's better anyway.
I've known you for 10 years. I've known you quite well for 10 years, and I still can't pronounce your name particularly brilliantly.
This is my favorite part of being on this show, is you actually
it's written here phonetically in English for me to try and pronounce, but it's still, even phonetically in English, it looks like unpronounceable Swedish. KARIN, what's the position like in Sweden? You were kind of the lone Western country holding the torch sort of against lockdowns. What's the picture there at the moment? And what do the finances and public policy look like? Are you about to emerge from this problem? We're hoping here in the UK we'll be opening up more on May the 17th and opening up pretty much fully from June the 21st.
Well, I mean, the vaccine rollout has been really, really slow. I mean, I would be lucky to get my first shot in maybe 6 weeks' time or so. I think it's about 30% of the population has had their first shot, so we really bungled that. On the other hand, I mean, we did not sort of induce a complete coma on the economy. So the sort of starting point was better. And also, if you look at our public debt levels, I think we're up to 26% now. And that has been after a kind of stimulus that we haven't seen for decades. So again, the starting point was quite gratifying to begin with. And I think that we will see some growth as well. But that said, I mean, I'm very optimistic short term about the economic forecasts. I'm quite worried about the more long-term effects, because I think one aspect that is missing completely in discussions in Sweden, but not only in Sweden but globally, is that we keep talking about growth, which is obviously important, but we should also be talking about productivity. And we should keep our eyes on that ball, especially now with this rather extreme monetary policy, but also with the stimulus packages, just sort of washing markets with money going nowhere at all.
Julian, welcome. Lovely to have you with us. Julian, a bit
Thanks,
like
Mark.
Andrew, I think you've been on the kind of slightly optimistic side of the ledger. I know it's been difficult to generate a huge amount of optimism, but do you think things are going to return to fine, you know, big spurts of growth? We'll be back to February 2020 levels of GDP soon? Or are there some real underlying problems here that we've made substantially worse and require a bit of political courage to tackle?
Okay, well, on balance, I'm probably a super optimist. I'm actually expecting the level of economic activity to return to its sort of pre-COVID peak as early as the autumn of this year. So, you know, some people are still expecting that not to happen until 2022 or even 2023. But I think we're going to see a very strong recovery over the next few months. And indeed, over the last few months, almost all the data has been better than expected. And even unemployment has actually started to fall, easing some of the concerns about a huge surge in the autumn when the furlough scheme is lifted. So I think there are lots of reasons to be positive. But that assumes that the recovery is allowed to proceed, that it's led by the private sector, by the market economy, and that the government doesn't decide that it's going to mess it up in one way or another. I mean, we've already touched on one way that the government might do that, which is by providing far too much fiscal and monetary stimulus at a time when the economy no longer needs it, and that would lead to inflation for a start, but also a very inefficient allocation of resources. I mean, there are lots of concerns. Again, actually, Mark, you mentioned one of them, the concern about youth unemployment. Now, as it happens, I think that young people will find it relatively easy to find new jobs, as they usually do, particularly because a lot of them were employed in the hospitality sector, which should reopen properly soon. But my concern is that the government will start worrying about youth unemployment and start throwing enormous amounts of money at subsidizing jobs for young people, and therefore penalizing people who are a bit older, who might have family responsibilities, particularly actually those people in their 40s, 50s, and maybe 60s who we want to keep working, who maybe don't attract the same attention in the headlines as younger people do. But there's a danger that by intervening to support one part of the labour market, the government ends up misallocating resources, spending loads of money in the wrong area. Also, of course, we're now getting hooked on the idea that the way to drive an economy is to spend enormous amounts of money. You touched earlier on the trillions that the Biden administration is planning to spend, again, at almost exactly the wrong time. The US economy was rebounding quite happily. The vaccine rollout was proceeding at a pretty fast pace before Biden took over. And yet they're planning for another 2 trillion over the next year or so, and several trillion after that, in a very poorly directed set of subsidies and direct employment schemes, this, that, and the other. So I'm optimistic about the private sector economy. And I think we'll see some big gains in productivity as things are shaken up there. But the government could get in the way and try and sort of replicate what went before, or just spend loads of money in inefficient and inflationary ways.
Konstantin, let me bring you back in. Are you feeling optimistic about the recovery? Or to Julian's point, I mean, I'm getting more and more frustrated when I raise with sort of government ministers, there might be a problem on youth unemployment. There's going to be a massive reallocation of labour. They're like, oh no, we've got an apprenticeship scheme. We've got more job support coaches. It's all being sort of done by the state, apparently. There was no sort of, we're going to remove regulation and lower the burden on small businesses or anything like that. It's all a government scheme to help us bounce back. Do you think, Konstantin, that's going to be the lasting legacy of this? When government grows big in a crisis, it stays big in peacetime.
Well, you make a good point, and I think particularly true that is of civil liberties. We've given a lot of them away, and whether we're going to get many of them back, I think, remains to be seen. But on the economy, I think people massively overestimate. Look, everyone is operating from their own bias here. I'm someone who's naturally quite optimistic. quite risk hungry, if you like. So I'm going to be going out and doing stuff and spending money. But I think we underestimate how terrified a lot of people are, because they've been told for a year by their government that they mustn't go out, they mustn't do anything. It's very scary, it's very bad. And I know a lot of people who are sitting at home and will continue to do that. They want to keep wearing masks, they want to keep not going out, they want to keep not doing things. So I think that actually society is going to be kind of split along two lines. There's going to be people who engage in the roaring 20s, and there's going to be a lot of people who don't and continue to be very careful and not go out and not do things and not spend money. So I think it remains to be seen. But of course, the other thing that we haven't touched in this conversation, and everybody's very optimistic about the vaccine rollout and everything else. What happens if there's a strain that is resistant to the vaccine, which there may well be this winter? Because I think people are massively not taking that into account. It's quite possible, and we've seen that the government, our government in the UK and elsewhere, will react to that, perhaps with the exception of Sweden, which I'm somewhat envious of in many ways. But the government will react very harshly if that happens. We'll lock everything down again. So I don't think we should get carried away. I think all things are still on the table.
So, Konstantin, this goes to my point that, you know, for 4 years we were a nation divided between Remainers and Leavers as far as the question of the European Union is concerned. We're still a nation divided between Remainers and Leavers, people who want to remain at home and people who want to leave the house, right? It's just a different remain, leave decision. But Konstantin, do you think the government has over-scared people? I mean, there was a friend of mine last night was pointing me to an opinion poll where the British electorate are asked to guess what proportion of the British population do you think have died of COVID? And the average guess was just shy of 10% of the British population. But most people were saying, I think about, somewhere in the region of 6 million people have died. I mean, it's terrifying that people think that, but has the government run a kind of brilliant information campaign, even if it scared people witless?
Well, I think you've answered your own question there. The actual figure, of course, is 0.1%. So they're out by 2 orders of magnitude in terms of the accuracy of their predictions. And equally, polling in America shows that particularly people who watch a lot of MSNBC and CNN, their estimates of your likelihood of being hospitalized with COVID is that 1 in 2 people, 50% of people will end up, when it's actually far, far lower. So but the media and the government have a lot to answer for, I think, on this issue. We've made this seem way worse than it actually is. People have been convinced that we are living in the middle of a plague when we're not. People have been very unwilling in the media to point out the average age of death being 83 years old in this country, which is actually above the average age of death for any other cause of death. And I think that will resonate, and that will stay with people for a long, long time. The impact of this is being massively underestimated, in my opinion. There are a lot of people who are scared witless, and if you tell them that some people are still not vaccinated, a lot of people will continue to stay home, I think, because as we keep being told, even if you have the vaccine, even if people you're out with have the vaccine, you must still wear masks, you must still socially distance. All of this stuff doesn't really make much sense. And when things don't make sense, I think people are naturally reluctant to take a risk.
Konstantin, been lovely to have you with us. Glad we overcame your camera problems. Thank you, sir. Fight the good fight. Check out his fantastic trigonometry channel. Well worth a watch. Look forward to speaking to you soon, sir. Karin, let me come back to you. You Swedes are a famously phlegmatic and sensible lot, right? So what are people in Sweden, what's the sort of, give me a sense of the kind of attitude of the median Swede, a shrug of the shoulders, or are people starting to get furious and angry either about incursions on liberty or the economic consequences of this, or is it a kind of keep calm and carry on? We've gone miles away from keep calm and carry on. How that could ever have been, that slogan you could not associate with this pandemic here in Britain. We're now told the new government slogan here is nobody is safe until everybody is safe, which is a particularly peculiar and inaccurate. But what's the sort of broad picture of the average Swede? What are they making of it all?
Well, I mean, it's pretty polarized here as well. There are a lot of people who are very angry with the government for not having done more. We had our fair share of people, asking the government to lock us in as well. But if I were to give to to say something about the general mood right now when the vaccine rollout is finally picking up pace, I would say it's more roaring 20s. I mean, we're not really able to do everything that we want to do yet, but we do see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think a lot of people are really anxious to get sort of the old world back at this point. So, I mean, I of course, there will be people who are afraid, a few will be, but I think most people will be very, very eager to get back to where they were before. So that's the good news. I'm in that sense, I'm actually quite optimistic. And I'm also, I think, more optimistic than Konstantin on, even if there is, you know, even if the worst comes and there is a new strand and we need more jabs, we're so much better prepared at this point. And I think also with countries like yours, where you've had proper lockdowns, I think it's actually going to be quite hard to do this again. I may be wrong, but I mean, I would assume that to be the case.
Julian, is that your take as well in Britain, that, you know, the Brits will sort of put up with a hell of a lot until we snap? We haven't snapped yet, and perhaps, you know, most of us will get through till June the 21st and, you know, then get back into life, and we'll just, I mean, I'm now literally counting off the days, you know, but you can count off the days until you can go into a restaurant. And because the end's in sight, I guess I'm less angry than I would be if it was open-ended. Do you think we'll phlegmatically just get to the end of it? People will probably go back. There'll probably be an overreaction initially, right? When the pubs in Soho reopened, it was compared to VE Day, I think, the first day that you could go there. So there might be a summer of people drinking even more than they should. But do you think people will snap back to normal, or might there be, you know, a variant comes along, seasonal flu? You know, we need some public policy response for that as well.
Yeah, well, I think there are a number of ways of looking at this. I mean, first of all, I'm pretty skeptical actually about opinion polls. I think people tend to say what they think they're expected to say. So I think people are probably more cautious in responding to opinion polls than they will be in practice. Certainly, all the anecdotal evidence I can provide is that people are desperate to get out. I was very excited yesterday to make my first indoor restaurant booking for about 2 weeks' time. So I'm certainly raring to go, and I've got loads of family coming to visit over the next few weeks and months as well, who'll be, I'm sure, in the same position. Ultimately, I'd watch what people do, not what they say. And you know, pretty much all the economic indicators that I follow, whether that's, you know, consumer confidence, retail spending, but also the business indicators, you know, investment intentions, hiring intentions, so on, are all pointing to a very strong recovery over the next few months. And we know that there's plenty of fuel there to drive that recovery, you know, but most people have been able to accumulate savings during the pandemic. I know many people haven't, but the majority have. And businesses also are awash with cash and looking to invest and hire. So I think that, you know, everything that I look at least as an economist, are pointing to a very strong recovery over the summer. And even if there is yet another wave in the autumn or winter, I think the public appetite for another lockdown is so limited that the government will just have to find a way to work through it.
Of course, I'm allowed to go back into a football stadium on June the 21st, 3 weeks after the football season ends. You know, that's the particularly bad bloody timing. I want to finish on a more upbeat note. You've been fairly optimistic, Julian, but I want to turn our attention to wider trade and sort of where we've got to on Brexit, which was the sort of biggest issue dominating everything. Eastern promise, is there a bit of Eastern promise here? Are the UK and India edging slowly towards a free trade deal? We're a long way from that now, but a couple of weeks ago, we here at the Institute published a report, we'll link to it in the chat, entitled Eastern Promise, Assessing the Future of UK-India Trade. Nobody assumed there'd be a sort of free trade deal within days or weeks, but we've got the makings of one. Yesterday morning, the Prime Minister announced a new trade and investment deal with India, apparently worth $1 billion, includes more than 500 million of investment from India to the UK, which is expected to create about 6,000 jobs. Hardly a colossal amount, but a step in the right direction, Julian. Do you think Britain, as a free trading nation, this might be a welcome shot in the arm to double down on the shot in the arm we're all receiving from vaccines? Is it transformative, or is it all going to be a bit marginal?
Well, it's a step in the right direction, is what I would say. I mean, first of all, if you believe a lot of the commentariat, Brexit is purely about UK-EU trade, and so all the focus has been on the increase in barriers to trade between the UK and the EU, which undoubtedly have had a negative impact in the short term, though actually a lot less than some people feared. And all the evidence is that the negative impact is fading over time rather than increasing. The benefits of Brexit will take a bit longer to come through, but they are there for all to see. A lot of the things that people were worried about for a start, such as the difficulty of rolling over existing trade agreements, well, they've all pretty much been done. And already we're starting to talk about new trade agreements with fast growing markets like India and the other opportunities that will open up. So I think over time will more than offset those short-term costs. As far as the Indian deal is concerned, it's only a step on the road towards a comprehensive free trade agreement, but it's got lots of positive elements. And, in particular, the possibility of more Indian professionals coming over here to work and Indian students coming here to study and then stay here for a couple of years after graduating. Now, the economic benefits of that are very hard to measure, but they can be significant. I mean, these are highly skilled people coming over here to build and grow businesses, to bring all sorts of knowledge and expertise over here, and that it's hard to say that's going to add 0.1% to GDP or 1% or whatever, but that's a clear plus. Areas like agriculture as well. There are loads of things that we couldn't do as members of the EU in terms of importing, cheap rice and mangoes and so on from India that we can now do. And of course, we're going to find it easier to sell our agricultural products and Scotch whisky and so on into India as well. So these are sort of marginal gains, but added together, I think they could be very significant. And hopefully it'll shake us out of another worrying trend I find, which is a sort of protectionist buy British attitude. That there seems to be a tendency to measure trade purely by the benefit you might get from the increase in exports. Whereas if we could do more trade with India in terms of importing more, whether that's high skilled people or, as I say, rice and mangoes, then there's some big benefits on the import side as well. So the win-win here isn't just about us exporting more to them. We benefit from importing more as well.
Yeah, and I know, Julian, you're doing some work for the IEA on that. There's a danger that politicians in particular talk about the only advantage in trade is to the seller. The buyer's always a mark rather than the buyer having an advantage as well. Karin, I've got to ask you, have you forgiven me for Brexit yet? Went through, nearly destroyed our relationship, went through, years of you refusing to have a drink with me. Are we over that now? Or do we only have to meet virtually?
I think we're over that now. If you open your pubs again and you buy me a beer and I'm able to get out of my own country after a year,
there's quite a number of hurdles here, right?
Anything basically at this point.
But what is your genuine view of how Brexit has gone? I mean, I've suggested that to some degree it's been a monumental fuss about nothing, right? I mean, none of the hugely bad stuff's happened. Obviously, COVID makes it difficult to work out exactly what disruptions were down to what, if you're on the Remain side. On the Leave side, well, yeah, there are some opportunities. We've rolled over trade deals, I think, more easily than some people thought we might. But a good number of those at this stage are just rollovers. There have been some augmentations with the Japan deal. We are applying to join the CPTPP. Is your perspective either personally, or do you think from the rest of the EU, which I guess it was in general 3 years ago, what's the UK doing? It's gone completely mad. It's gone nuts. Why on earth would they do this? It looks like they've pretty much got away with this unscathed. And of course, the vaccination programme, I don't want to tie that directly to Brexit, but there's a case could be made that having escaped the sort of regulatory orbit of the European Medicines Agency, that at least gave us the chance to roll out faster than other European countries, and we surely have.
No, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I mean, when the process was finalized, I think there was quite a lot of relief, actually from all sides, because it just was such a painful process in itself. And then, in a way, I think it had a very unifying effect on the European Union as such, that it became very important for the member states to show all the sort of the benefits that were in there. But the vaccine process did matter. Because I think there was some glee about what people perceived would happen to the UK. And then when especially the Commission completely screwed up, sorry, the whole procurement process of the vaccine. And you guys actually did very well with this, that glee sort of melted away. And after that, basically all of the discussions have just been about sort of the mishaps that have happened in step after step after step after step. And I think that has sort of, in a way, also cracked up a bit of that, that unifying force that Brexit actually entailed for us. But now the overall feeling is just that it's good that it's done. People just want to find a constructive way to go about our business and to get our economies going. And I think, generally people understand that, being small-minded at this point is really rather stupid. So to try to find a good way of sort of coexisting, I think is a fairly high priority.
And don't you think, Karin, that there might be a bit of welcome competition? I mean, I'm not wishing on Sweden or the EU to get everything wrong. I just welcome a bit of competition here. And, we might be able to look over to the EU and say, well, actually, they regulate this sector rather better than we do. We should learn from them and vice versa. I mean, all of the arguments that free market liberals like ourselves put about competition and the discovery process, that might well apply to the UK being on the outside here as well now. I mean, for example, I was going to say I don't want to crow about it. Actually, no, reflecting on it, I do want to crow about it, actually. We were sort of told, it takes 7 years to do a trade deal, as if this was some sort of law of Newtonian physics. No. It takes 7 years for the EU to do a trade deal. It does not take 7 years for the UK to do a trade deal. It might be that the EU's aspiring to much more comprehensive agreements. The attempt to get a trade deal with America was, a colossal attempt at a comprehensive agreement, not incremental. But do you think, Karin, that, I mean, it's not as if the UK and the rest of Western Europe are going to diverge enormously, but having some regulatory competition and us, being encouraged to keep up with each other, who's rolling out this medical program better, who's signing the, better trade deals with X, Y, or Z, could be win-win, right? We think competition is a good thing. It's not just about winners and losers. It's about the people who are losing learning from the winners.
No, for sure. I mean, I would have preferred for you to stay, but now that you're not, I mean, I do think that there's quite a lot to be said about that kind of competition, not least now when you have these ridiculous talks about strategic autonomy and France actually pretty much having the initiative in terms of what kind of trade philosophy we want to have amongst ourselves. And I mean, for him, COVID has really been a beautiful opportunity to be as French as a Frenchman can be. It's all about protectionism, just going back to that. And again, it would have been easier for us, I think, to counter that had you still been within the union. But the fact that you're not also, of course, sets an example of what you can do if you choose a different path. So, I mean, I would very much like for you to succeed and to succeed well. I mean, also in that particular regard.
Julian, what's your audit? You I think it's fair to say you've been proven right on most of your predictions about Brexit. You've been warning about some of the more apocalyptic predictions wouldn't come true. They haven't. Appreciate it's difficult to disentangle some of the disruptions. Is it COVID? Is it Brexit? Or would the Brexit disruption have been bigger if trade flows had been higher because there wasn't the COVID problem? But what's your audit to date? We've now been out for, fully and totally out for 4 and a bit months now, going as well as could have been expected?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, if I were to sort of quantify the impact of Brexit on the economy so far this year, I'd actually say it's a fairly sizable positive. Obviously, you've had the negative of the disruption to trade in the early months of the year, but that seems to be fading. Against that, there's the lifting of uncertainty, and I think that's going to provide a big boost to business investment over the next few years, including areas like the city. I mean, there's supposed to be a massive exodus of jobs from the city. That simply hasn't happened. So there's that positive to come through. I personally would count the faster rollout of the vaccine as a benefit of Brexit, or at least an illustration of the benefits of diverging from the EU's way of doing things. Partly in terms of regulation, greater flexibility in regulation, and there are all sorts of other areas from financial services to biosciences and other things that we can get further gains from there. But also the flexibility of doing things as a single nation state. I mean, you mentioned the example of trade deals. I think that's an excellent one. I mean, I think we're able to do better deals to acquire vaccines on our own. I think we'll be able to do better trade deals as well. So even if in sort of strict legal terms we could have diverged from the EU, even as a full member, I think it's no coincidence that Brexit Britain was the only country to do so. And we're clearly reaping the benefits, which might easily be, in addition, of course, to the health benefits, 2 to 3% of GDP this year. And that more than offsets any disruption to UK-EU trade.
And Julian, do you think that the potential future gains to the UK, if we were to seize some of the opportunities here rather than to make a complete mess of them, are they about looking back at a lot of the regulations that are on the statute books? I don't know, MiFID II, GDPR, these things that are, one on data collection, one on financial instruments. Is it a question of looking at that and scrapping them or amending them? Or are the benefits actually much vaguer in the sense that it might be just a prediction that future things that come along, biotech, artificial intelligence, who knows what, that you just think the UK has a better chance of making a better fist of regulating it than the EU on balance, even though we don't even know what these new industries will necessarily look like? Which is it? More one, more the other, 50-50?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, but it's actually more looking forward than the regulations that we've acquired from the EU. After all, the UK at the moment is a relatively flexible economy already. And I know that we could easily come up with a list of 10, 20, 30 things that we've acquired from the EU that we would change. But I think I'll probably take the view that the benefits from those would be relatively small. It's more about looking forward about what the new growth industries are going to be. I think it's important to recognise the direction of travel of the EU is clearly towards ever closer union, more regulation, more harmonisation and so on. And I think by stepping aside from that over the next 10, 20, 30 years, I think that's where the big benefits on the regulatory side are going to come. So I'm sure there are plenty of regulations that we could get rid of. And you mentioned MiFID II. I'm sure we could simplify that. And loads of other regulations in the financial sector as well that I'd want to look again at. And lots of other areas as well, particularly in things like agriculture. But by and large, it's the future opportunities, the opportunities that diverge in future that I think are going to be more important. And it's also, of course, that opportunity to diverge from the EU that makes it much easier to do big, bold trade deals with the rest of the world, which we know is going to be the much faster growing markets for the UK than anything that the EU can offer.
Karin, what's your take on this? You've said you wanted the UK to stay in. That one's passed. You've forgiven me. You'll now allow me to buy you a beer again at some point in the future when we're legally entitled to meet. But what's your best guess? Because I think this is guesswork. I didn't like all of the modelling about if we leave the EU, the average household will be £4,172.37 worse off in 10 years. I mean, that's sort of nonsense to make it that specific. But is your hunch, Karin, that over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that the European Union and its member states are likely to regulate more sensibly about things and industries that come along, or even the legacy industries, or that Brexit Britain's likely to? Where would you put your money?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on what kind of government you will have. It's not, you're not entirely dependent on what happens in the EU, but I've been very optimistic so far. I would have to say that I'm increasingly pessimistic about the EU. I think the fact, the Corona bonds and this idea that we should all have, mutual debt, and the way that they roll out the stimulus packages and so forth, I think just basically spell disaster as it is right now. I think it's going to really increase tensions, and it's possible that it's going to bring out the worst, I think, from both the North and the South. And it's going to be very, very difficult to stop this process, because it's gained such momentum that every time there is a crisis, the only way to get out of the crisis is to just increase the speed of integration. And that's just basically the formula. And this is considered to be a major crisis. So then you have to have a major push for more integration. And we weren't ready for that before the crisis, as it were.
Do you think, though, Karin, is there anything that might knock the EU into a kind of serious, we've got to reform ourselves mindset? I mean, I thought that the Brexit process, or even the referendum, or David Cameron's renegotiation, might at least start to do that. That it might begin to, well, hang on, we've got a bit of a problem here. You know, the UK Prime Minister Cameron at the time is saying that, you know, he's going to have to hold a referendum and they might vote to leave. No, that just sort of was water off a duck's back. We vote to leave, and I think the view was, well, they don't really mean it. You know, they'll be coming back begging in 2 years' time to rejoin, I'm sure. And now we have left, and there doesn't. I mean, I'm not saying the EU should set all of its agenda and policy and future direction just because we've decided to exit the club. But it seems extraordinarily difficult to get a message through. They're really not listening to complaints about them. I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker, for example, I saw the other week, was sort of saying one of the great errors was David Cameron not allowing him to campaign in the UK for further European integration. My judgment would have been that would have been a catastrophe for the Remain side. But that's the lesson he's drawn. Not perhaps we need more flexibility or more variable geometry about how we all come together. It's always just more Europe, more Europe, more Europe. How do you ever get the EU off that track?
Well, I think you need to increase the price tag. I mean, if we have another Greece, you know, if Italy defaults, or, you know, we have a financial crisis where we really need to put in a lot of money from the north and the west into the south, or wherever sort of the disaster has happened. I think, you know, and especially if it happens before the economy recovers, and you're still reeling a bit from the COVID crisis. If this happens closely in time, I think that might set some motions into play that could change things. But that's really sort of the only thing that I can think of that might actually sort of have people take a step back and say that, okay, so people are really not happy about this. Like really, really, really not happy about this. Nobody was all that surprised about you leaving, because it was fairly obvious for the past 20 years or so that you really didn't like our company, you know, in Brussels. You've always been the difficult one. But if it were a country that, one of the core countries, I mean, say if
the
Germany,
Netherlands, or
you know, the Netherlands, or you know, Finland. You know, Finland is really quite interesting in that regard, that they've changed quite a lot. And since everybody needs to be on board, you know, then that might either, you know, that would crack the entire thing up, or it might actually lead to the EU reforming in a sort of in a more positive way.
Julian, what's your thought on this? I mean, you know, I wish the EU no ill. Well, I certainly don't wish the citizens of the EU any ill. I would like to see them become a more liberalised economy, less centralised, less bureaucratic. Do you think there's any prospect for the EU reforming? It doesn't mean that they just have to listen to us Brits, but it does seem to be tone deaf in terms of, you know, Brexit brushed aside. I tell you what Karin's saying, we've always been the, you know, the awkward member of the family, but there seems to be a shrug of the shoulders at any sort of discontent, or, you know, Eurosceptic parties have done well in countries other than the UK. That's just sort of waved away, and the project just at the moment just continues on its current trajectory without any apparent inclination from the driver or the people piloting this that they might even want to change by a smidgen of a degree, no?
Yes, I think I would be relatively pessimistic here. I'm always struck by the degree of popular support across Europe for the European Union. And this is something that as a Brit I find hard to understand, but maybe that's because, of course, we've got a very different history here of what happened during the wars and empire and outward looking compared to Europe, which is much more inward looking. But if you look at the recent opinion polls, even the European Commission's botched rollout of the vaccines, it seems to be that national governments are getting at least as much blame for this as the European Union itself. There's an opinion poll that showed that in France, more than 50% of French people blame the French government for the slow rollout of the vaccines, and only about, say, 20-25% blame the European Commission, which I thought was almost the wrong way round. So I wouldn't underestimate the degree of popular support across Europe for the EU, even in countries like Greece and Italy, where there's been next to no economic growth or massive recessions over the last 10 years or so, partly as a result of the constraints of the euro. There's still a feeling that they're better off in than than out. So I wouldn't look to the south to change things, but it may well be the north. That at some point the German taxpayer or the Finnish taxpayer, the Dutch taxpayer will get fed up of the bills that it's going to be facing for continuing to support the south. Maybe it'll be some sort of financial breakage that would cause the problems. But as I say, it's not going to happen overnight. It's certainly not going to happen as relatively quickly as it has done in the UK.
I want to finish by asking each of you, Julian, I'll start with you. Is there any country in the world that we should be looking to as a role model here, right? I mean, I've suggested it might be Brexit Britain for the rest of the EU. I'm not sure I'm going to pull that one. Is there anywhere where we can point to and say, well, comparatively, those guys seem to be getting it right? This concerns me a bit when, 10 months ago, everybody was saying, well, look, Belarus hasn't had a lockdown. We can still watch Belarusian football on television. Yeah, but I'm not sure Belarus is necessarily the role model about where I would want to take the country. Is there anywhere across the globe, needn't be in the Northern Hemisphere, needn't be in Western Europe, Julian, where we can sort of say that those guys at the moment seem to be getting it about right? They're balancing their books, they're liberalising their economy, they've got productivity and growth going up. Anywhere to look to, or is everybody sort of tilting slightly in the wrong direction?
Well, as far as the response to COVID is concerned, it's very hard to say, but of course, almost every country faces very different circumstances. So people are pointing, for example, to New Zealand as a great success story, but frankly, it's dead easy if you're a small island, thousands of miles from anywhere important. So I'd be wary of saying
a bit like the UK.
Well, yeah, of course, we've got Europe on the doorstep and much more open and different demographics, all sorts of different reasons. So I think it's hard to say unambiguously that one country has handled the health crisis better than any other. I think actually the UK has handled the economic fallout relatively well. I think we responded pretty effectively with coordinated fiscal and monetary policy fairly well. It's not just me saying that. People like the IMF have praised the response of the government too. So I think on sort of pure economics, we're doing well. Looking forward though, where should we be looking for models? I think some of the smaller, more dynamic countries like Australia, actually New Zealand, as far as free trade is concerned, Singapore, Hong Kong, these are much more outward-looking economies, partly because they themselves are so small that they need to be outward-looking, and they're the countries that have been much more dynamic. Whereas it's the big, clunky trade blocs like the EU, which some people describe as the world's biggest free trade area. I actually describe it as the world's biggest protectionist and regulatory bloc. I think we need to look to some smaller countries to see how they are thriving in a global economy, rather than just trying to look to our near neighbours and remain heavily tied to them.
Karin, let me finish with you. Do you have your dream country in mind? If I can't persuade you, it's Brexit Britain. Where might it be?
That might be hard. No, I would probably point to Taiwan. And it's partly emotional. I used to live there. I love the country, but I think I'm not alone in being really impressed with the way that they dealt with the pandemic. I mean, being so close to China, and not having almost any deaths whatsoever, and not having locked down either. I think they did basically everything right. And not having all that much more information than anybody else. I mean, it's true that they, as well as Hong Kong did, have some more experiences from SARS pandemics before, but they were very quick. They moved fast, and I think they kept their heads cool. So I would say that Taiwan is in many regards a very admirable country that we should support more. And then I also have to say, now that we're all getting nationalistic here, that I think that even if Sweden bungled quite a lot, I'm surprised, but rather proud of actually living in a country where and I never thought that would happen. I've had a social democratic prime minister say that what we think is important is that people trust their own good judgment. Never thought it would happen, but still very refreshing, being 40 years old and finally having heard that from a social democrat.
So you've got a social democratic government with liberal sentiments, and we've got a conservative government with social democratic sentiments, basically.
Yes, sir.
Well, much to learn from Sweden as well then. Great fan of Sweden, lovely country. Julian and Karin, wonderful to have you with us. Thanks very much for joining us. Thanks to my previous guests as well. Tom Palmer, Andrew Lilico, KONSTANTIN, KISIN, lovely to have you all with us. Thanks all for watching. If you're minded to become an IEA online patron, please do so. For a very small amount of money every month, you can keep us producing this digital content. And yes, to those in chat, that will allow me to buy a more expensive microphone. We're saving up. You can help us. You can help us do that if you become an IEA online patron. Please do click the link in the chat or in the show notes. Also, sign up to our Think conference. The latest iteration is coming on the 12th of June. Free tickets are available for the virtual event, and we've got a line of excellent speakers lined up already. They include Tim Harford, Sir Vince Cable, Matthew McCaffrey, and Juliet Samuels. You can click on the link that we'll share on the screen on YouTube just now, but completely free to sign up for that conference if you wish to join us virtually. If you're not already a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, at least take that step. The next step's to become an IEA online patron. Click the subscribe button and the notification bell. That will keep you informed of all of our upcoming broadcasts. Thanks to all of our donors and supporters. Thanks very much for watching. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.